Hey, just a quick note to let you know that this video is a pre-recorded live event. If you'd like to join our upcoming events, such as demos and office hours, you can check out our schedule on our support page. Hope you find this video helpful and look forward to seeing you in our next event. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the live demo. This demo today, I'm going to be going through and talking about Microsoft pivot tables in Microsoft Excel and how you can use those with your ZooMonitor export and your ZooMonitor behavior data. So if you're completely new to pivot tables, so this is a tool that basically allows you to quickly reorganize and summarize your data. So for instance, if there are some questions you want to know, things like, how many times have you observed a behavior in a given month? How many sessions have been recorded in different time periods if you're checking for maybe project management purposes? What was the average duration of a behavior across different study periods? I mean, this is basically what pivot tables are for, and allows you to very quickly get some of those answers that you're looking for. And so today what we're going to be doing is we're going to calculate the average percent of time our pygmy hippos were on different substrates across the morning and afternoon time periods. If you have seen any of my demos, I love my pygmy hippos, and I'm going to keep using them as my example for the end of time. All right, let me go ahead and screen share with you. All right, so hopefully everyone can see right now, see the iPad screen. And so this is basically just a quick setup of what the project looks like in ZooMonitor. So I wanted to kind of introduce everyone to that before jumping into what the export looks like before we jump into the pivot table. So in this project, so this is our ongoing behavior monitoring project we have at Lincoln Park Zoo for our pygmy hippos. And so a couple of the things that we record for our hippos are things like the temperature during the session, at the start of the session, the observation time, and so that's that morning AM or PM that we're going to be looking at, and then which pygmy hippo is on exhibit, so an access question there. And then just to give you an idea in this, what we're recording behavior-wise for the project, so we have our individuals there, Annie and Pogo. Those are our current pygmy hippos. I think in the export you might see Pogo, or you might see our previous male, Howie. But we have two pygmy hippos that you'll see in the export. There's a few channels here, you'll notice. So we have an all occurrence channel for some really key behaviors that we're tracking. We have an interval behaviors channel there that has basically our general behavior and activities. And then we have another channel for height. And so that's the one we're going to be looking at a little bit more today. And so that one, there's just three. There's just land, partially submerged, and submerged. And at the bottom, you can see we're recording space use for that project as well. And you can see the map down there at the bottom of the iPad screen. Okay, so let me go ahead and share with you our Excel export here. Hopefully everyone can see the export here. Kim, can you? Yep. Okay, perfect. So with our export, so if you're familiar with the ZooMonitor export, you'll know we have a lot of columns, in the export, and then there'll be quite a lot of rows. And so technically this export, I guess, would be called more of a wide or a long format. So there's data structured vertically down the export. So you'll see it kind of going down the export, and then you'll see columns for the different variables. To give you kind of a much bigger look at what the export looks like, I wanted to just kind of zoom out right here, and I have it color coded on kind of what the general structure of our export is, if you're not familiar. So to start the export, there's a number of columns there that basically just cover session details. So those are some things that you might drag in to your pivot table if you're interested in pulling out some of that information. The yellow ones there are all of the data. And so I have the light yellow or light orange there are some of the details for the behavior data. And then the darker orange or yellow color there is the actual behavior data. And you can see with the behavior data, for instance, this first one here, you'll see there's 10 rows for the 10 intervals. So everything you record in ZooMonitor gets its own separate row. And so that's why it's that long format. And then at the end of your export, you'll see a few columns there for the session questions. And so these are those things that I had showed on the iPad screen, things like temperature. In this project, it's temperature, time period, which is the AM or PM you see here, and then what they have access to here. And so that's that last column there. And so those are, that's basically just kind of a big picture look at what the export is for this project and just in general, just to orient everyone there. And so to get started with our pivot table, the first thing we're going to do is we are going to select, click up in the top corner here, and I'm going to select all the entire table on this sheet here. And I'm going to go up to Insert and then Pivot Table. And I should mention really quickly, I'm using Excel, Microsoft Excel 365. That comes with the 365 subscription package. If you are using one of the previous versions or a different version of that, some of these things might look different in your version. However, pivot tables would still be available pretty much in all of those versions of Excel to my knowledge. So this first little pop-up window you see here asks you basically the range. And so you can see it basically selects the entire range that we had selected there. And then do you want it as a new worksheet or existing? We're going to do a new worksheet. Before I click OK, which will open up the pivot table, I did want to comment on one common mistake that you could run into with your pivot table. And that's having a column here that's blank. And so the way the pivot table works is the first row here, there needs to be a value in every column that you're using for your pivot table. And so for instance, if I had accidentally deleted, let's say this cell right here, L1, where it says month, if I had deleted that and then tried to create this pivot table, I'd get an error message telling me that it's not going to work. And so just make sure if you do see that, that's probably one of the most common issues I run into is that there'll accidentally be a missing cell up in this first row. But if you do see an error message that's sounding like that, just give a quick scan of those and just make sure that you're not you don't have any blanks up there. Okay, so now this is basically what the pivot table will look like. And so over here is basically where the pivot table will get built. And then here is where we will add our different variables. And so for us, we want to know for the pygmy hippos how much time they were spending in those different substrate categories. So that submerged, partially submerged, and on land. And so the first thing we want to do is we want to summarize it by session. So we want to know how many intervals. So there's 10 intervals. We record 10 intervals per observation. And we want to know how many intervals were recorded for each of those categories. And so some of the first things we're going to pull down are session ID. And so we're going to pull that down to the rows. And you see when we pulled session ID down to the rows, it all of a sudden took all of the session IDs. And the session ID is basically a unique identifier for every session that you record. And so that if you ever need a unique identifier for your analysis and whatever you're doing, session ID is always going to be your friend there. And so you can see I pulled that down. So there's basically one row now for every session we recorded. And so that's a good start. That's kind of what we want is one row per session. And now we want to have how many intervals happened for those behaviors for each session. And so that channel here was interval channel 2. And so I'm going to grab interval channel 2 value, this here, drag it down to the values. And you see by doing that, essentially what it does now is it just does a count of how many intervals were recorded per session. And so if you want to check If you have missing missing data or missing intervals for some of your projects, this is an easy way to do that. So obviously, this number should never be larger than 10, since we recorded a maximum of 10 intervals each session. But you can see some of these sessions here, we didn't record a full 10 intervals. And the reason for that is how we record that space use data. So when animals are not visible, we don't record that space use, or that that height data or that substrate data. We leave that blank. And so you can see some of these sessions here where, this first session here, where only one instance was recorded of that channel. That's one where likely the animal was not visible for 9 of those 10 intervals there. But this is still not quite what we're looking for. So we obviously want to know per behavior value how many how many cases, how many instances are there for each one. And so if you grab that interval channel 2 value and drag it down to columns, you'll see that it's now showing it as these columns here. And so this is getting pretty close. And the one thing I should mention too that I think wasn't showing here is how the pivot table was set up. And so, of course, there we go. So I'm going to go to the design tab and just show you really quick how this pivot table is formatted, because this might not be what you're seeing if you were to go directly from the ZooMonitor export into this. And so a couple of the things that I do is I turn off subtotals. So if you go to the subtotals here, do not show subtotals. So that's a pretty easy one that I do right away, because generally I'm not looking to get subtotals. I want just to know on a per row basis there. And then the second one I do is I go in the report layout button here, I click to have it in tabular form, and then repeat all items. And so you see it's a little bit different here, but now it can be a little bit more user-friendly, I found personally, in having it in that tabular form than the compact or outline form for how I look through these tables here. Okay, so with that, so we have right now the number of intervals per value. So 1 in land. The second session, all 10 were recorded and partially submerged. So we're getting pretty close. What we want to do next is now we want these to be a percentage. And so you could copy and paste this data in another sheet, and you could manually calculate that. You could take this number and then divide it by your grand total, right? Or you could divide it by 10, the total number of intervals, however you want to calculate that. Generally, the way we calculate our percents is we'll do it the percent of the number of recorded instances here. So we do it out of this grand total here. So if there was only 2 times, it's percent of time visible is the metric there. And so if there was 2 times visible that land was recorded, that's 100% of time land was recorded. That can obviously be a little tricky if you have cases like this where you have a lot of situations where there might only be 1 or a few intervals, because those few intervals could add up to 100%, which for another session that the animal is visible the entire time, you would need the entire 10 intervals to be 100%. So just be careful certainly with that. If you do have situations like this, this is certainly a case for maybe just dividing it out of 10 and not having it the percent of time visible, but the percent of total time there. And so the easy way, very easy way, if you're ever trying to calculate the percent of these values out of your grand total here, you can right click and you can go to show value as, and then you can do percent of row total here. And so you see doing that, all of a sudden now I have those percentages for how much the percent of the time visible, the percent of the visible intervals was recorded for each of these behaviors. There's a few more things we'll probably want in this pivot table. So obviously session ID, that's great, but that doesn't really tell us when the session happened. That could be hard to interpret. And so what I typically would do is take the session start time and I'll drag that up here under the session ID to have as a second column. And so what you saw right there when I just put session start time there is what Excel is doing is it's basically trying to intelligently aggregate your date information. So it detected that that session start time variable was a date, and it's trying to be smart and give you things like years, quarters, and then the times there. Generally, we obviously don't want that. And so the easy way to get rid of that is if you just right click in a cell here and you go to ungroup. You'll see when you click ungroup, it basically removes that automatic aggregation that you just saw, and then you'll get your session start time here. Of course, there's another really key piece that's missing in this pivot table, and that is individual, right? So we want to know focal individual probably for each of these. So right now it's we only record one animal per session, and so that's why you saw it was only having 10 intervals. But we'll want to know this for each individual. So one way you can do that is you can just drag focal name down here in your pivot table. And you see that by doing that, now we have another column here that's showing for this session, was this Annie or was this Pogo that was recorded for that session? So making it very easy to work with your data there. Let me think, is there anything else we want to add to this? Yeah, there is actually. So our question that we're interested in, right? Our observation time. So if you go down and you have your session questions, so always remember your session questions are going to be at the end of your export. So always at the bottom of your list here. This list is showing in the order that they show up in your columns in your export there. And so if you click observation time, drag that down there, you'll see it's tossing your observation time down there. And like I said earlier with the subtotals, if you're doing this, you might see some of those subtotals popping up. So just remember to go in and just click that subtotal button in the design tab and then do not show subtotals if you're seeing that pop up there. And so right now, I think pretty much we've got what we might want here. And so we have each row is a separate session. And then we have the start time of the session, who the individual was, and then the time period, AM or PM, that the session happened, one of our session questions. And then we have these percents here. You could also easily work with these. If you want to go back to having these as intervals, you would just click there, very easily go to show value, and then you can go back to no calculation. So very simple to switch between those. And so the next step, so we've got this pivot table here. So the next step is I want to now have a table that's telling me for the AM, how many sessions was Annie recorded, how many sessions was Pogo recorded, and what was the average percent of time that they were on land or partially submerged or submerged for those two time periods. And so this is certainly the first step to getting that, because at this point we've aggregated per session, but we haven't aggregated per time period. And so that's really the next step we have here. And so to do that, I'm going to select all the table here. Oh, actually, before I do that, this is a good reminder here. Because I'm doing those, the percent of row total, you'll see that there are some sessions like this one right here that I have highlighted where basically the animal was not visible the entire time and nothing in that channel was recorded. So you can see that there's not a 0 over here, but basically nothing was recorded here for this session for Annie because she was not visible all 10 intervals. And so if you do go to show value as percent of row total, you're going to get a divide by 0 error naturally because your total number of intervals that you had there are 0. And so to fix that, what you're going to want to do is, of your choices here, filter out blanks. And so you see when I did that, now all of a sudden it doesn't have any of those divide by 0 errors because it's removing any of those blank ones there. So if you go, and to filter any of those values, it's right here, this filter button. And you can see we have land, partially submerged, and submerged, and I just unchecked blank. So unchecking blank, now all of a sudden my data is showing that. If you're not working with the calculated percents there, that what I did in that show value as, and you're working with just the general interval data, you don't need to worry about that because you're not going to get that error there. Okay, so let me go ahead and select these again. All right, I'm going to scroll down. Control C. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste this into another sheet. And so I'm going to right click. I'm going to paste as values here. And then let me just get these columns set up. Okay. So you can see now we've got our percent. So it took our percents and converted them to proportion, but still the same idea here. Each of these should add up to 100 or 1. And so you can see down here in the auto calculation, the sum here is 1. And as you scroll down, this should stay obviously a whole number because each of these is going to add up to 1 here. The one thing it does do when you paste as values that you'll notice here is your session start time will be in this date code now, and it's not formatted properly as a date time. And so it's pretty easy to fix that. If you right click on the whole column, so up where it says B, you go to Format Cells, and then you choose Custom. You could choose date or time, but this is actually a date time value here. And so if you go to Custom and scroll down, you'll see this option right here where it says month/day/year, year, and then hours, minutes. You can click that, and then that should give you kind of what you had before there. So like I said, the thing we're trying to get after here is how many, what the percentage of time Annie was doing these behaviors in AM and PM. So a much smaller table. So what I'm going to do now that we've copied and pasted this into another sheet, I'm going to quickly select. So I just hit Control Shift and then the down arrow. And so that's a way you can easily jump down and select your entire list of data there. And so I have that. And then so I'm going to go up and insert another pivot table here. And so like I said, the same thing applies. Just make sure that you have obviously all of these rows have a value in them at the top. You can't have any blanks there. All right, so now we're in a second pivot table. And so just to kind of recap that, basically our first pivot table was to get our percent of time or percent of visible time, which is what we calculated here, on a per session basis. And then our second one is going to now aggregate it on a per time period basis, or that could easily be treatments, whatever sort of variable that you want to aggregate by. That's what you can do there. And so for this one, we're not going to drag session ID down here, right? Because if I were to do that, we're back to square one, and we've got a ton of rows here now for session ID. So that's not really helping us. So what we want now is we want to know by focal name and by observation time, right? And you'll see now we have Annie and Pogo and AM and PM. And the reason I chose this channel, you could have easily done this with your behavior channel. I chose this channel because there's only 3 values, and you'll see in a second why it's a little bit easier to work with that. The same process applies if you had many more values in your whole behavior channel. So the first one I usually will do is I'll drag down one of the values here, land, and I will convert it to a count. So I will go to summarize values by, so I right-clicked here where it says sum of land, go to summarize values by, and then I turn it into a count. And so that's really nice because now you have the number of sessions for each time period for Annie and Pogo. And then all I'm going to do is click that land again and drag it down into here. And you see by doing that second one, it's now giving me a sum. I don't want a sum though, right? Because what I want is the average percent of time, mean percent. Right? And so right now it's adding up all of the percentages, but what I want it to do is average. And so to change that, we're just going to do that same step again. We're going to go to summarize values by and change it to an average. So pretty simple, straightforward there. And you can see that it now has our averages. So I'm just going to repeat that step for partially submerged and submerged. Okay, so we've got that all set up. However, you will see that this table isn't looking quite like the previous table, and that is because it is not for it is subtotaling, and it's not listing it as in tabular form there. So if we go to that design tab again, and then we go to do not show subtotals, you'll see it'll turn off those subtotals that we're showing for Annie and Pogo. And then if we go to show in tabular form, this is the next step we'll get. So now it's showing before, this column here was actually kind of living sort of indented, but underneath vocal name here. So now it's a separate column for each of these. And the last step there is we want this to be Annie, Annie, Pogo, and Pogo. And to do that, you just easily click repeat all item labels. And so this is how I set up my pivot tables. There's certainly lots of ways that you can set up your pivot table, but I find this easy to work with this data and to be able to visualize it and know what is in each row. And so here you can see we've got our table we were after. This is the data we were looking for right here. So obviously that went a lot longer because I was slowly going through each of those steps, but that could have easily been done in maybe a minute or so. You could calculate these averages for how much time, the percent of time the animal is in land, partially submerged and submerged. One of the things I'll do just to make sure everything went correctly here is I'll often select the cells there and make sure that they add up to 1 or 100% in this case. That can be important because if there is maybe another value here that you forgot to include, like for this example, I only have 3 values in this channel. It's very hard to miss 3 values. But when you pull in and you do this for your behavior channel, for instance, interval channel 1 for this project that you saw earlier, there's maybe 20 to 30 behaviors there. And so dragging over each of those and turning them into average, you could easily forget and miss one of those behaviors. And so this is a nice way to easily make sure that everything is adding up to 100% here. So if you select all of these, you should see, obviously, it should add up to 4 because each of these averages should be averaging out to 100% there. So if you don't see that adding up to a whole number down here, that likely means you probably forgot to drag one of your values down into that values box in your previous pivot table there. And so, yeah, you can see basically we've got all of this data set up. If you were to go now and want to graph this, I'm not going to go through those steps today, but it's basically the same process. You're going to want to select your data. So I'm just going to select it, hit copy, and then I will paste it here in another sheet. And then from here, I can graph this data to my heart's content in Excel and make whatever visuals that I need there. So pretty quick and pretty easy to get to that process. And so you can see hopefully how powerful pivot tables are for just in general, for data analysis, and then specifically for how they work with the ZooMonitor export, because the ZooMonitor export is in this long format. So you're not getting summarized data directly out of ZooMonitor. And so you need to first do that step to summarize your data by things like session before you can start asking some of those questions of, what was the average percent by a certain time period or something like that. So, yeah, let me go ahead and come back here and I'll stop sharing. Okay, perfect. So I hope that was helpful for everyone. If you, of course, have any questions, always feel free to reach out to me. I'm definitely happy to help you with any issues you run into there. And yeah, good luck with your analysis. Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked that video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel to be notified when we release more videos. If you have any questions about ZooMonitor, you can always feel free to contact us at ZooMonitor@lpzoo.org. Thanks.